So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're happy to welcome Christian Schroeder de Witt with us, who's going to be telling us about AI for climate policy and the road to impact. So Christian, if I remember, or if it's up to date, is a postdoc in the Forster AI lab at Oxford, where he works with Jacob Forster. He's also published foundational machine learning research work, as well as a variety of highly interdisciplinary works that span climate science, economics, other disciplines, and whatnot. And his work is currently on bringing multi-agent reinforcement learning to a variety of world applications, real-world applications. So yeah.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And hi, everybody. I'll try to share my screen now. I hope this is going to work straight away. If it does not, please do let me know. Then I can fix it. Yes, I'm very honored today to have been invited. I'm one of the advisors on the AI for Global Climate Cooperation. Yeah, my talk today is AI for Climate Policy, the road to impact. I must honestly say, since I got started on preparing those slides, I've realized actually I'm a bit more focused on my talk. So actually, there are applications of AI to climate policy, such as summarization, you know, like all this NLP stuff, developing argumentation, and that I'm not going to talk about. So I'm focusing on AI4GCC today. And actually also realized that maybe this would have been a more adequate title, Tips and Tricks for Winning AI4GCC, with a little disclaimer that I'm not the independent jury, and the independent jury may have different opinions on things. So don't you know, make up your own mind. Having said that, structure of my talk today, well, where I'm coming from a little bit, want to explain a little bit, then overview what's the competition about, and then I'm going to share some tips, tricks, and thoughts on all three tracks. And in the end, ask the question, what kind of real-world impact would I like to see for AI4GCC, and maybe how we can get there. Okay, so I'm going to wear two different hats in this talk. One is, the left one is AI researcher hat, and the right one is policymaker's hat. And I'm going to explain a bit where this is coming from, and I will indicate to you which hat I'm wearing at any one time. I thought I would have some real hats here, but like no, maybe it's not necessary. Okay, as Andrew already introduced me, I'm postdoc at FLAIR at Oxford. The background is in physics and computer science. Now I'm doing fundamental AI research. Deep multi-agent learning is my specialty, and more broadly, I'm working in cooperative AI, which is a young subject area that is about like, how do I learn to create AI, or how can I create AI that can lead humans, institutions, and AI agents to cooperate in any mix thereof. Highly recommended research area. Yeah, I might be known, if some of you are familiar with deep multi-agent learning. This is some of the work I've been involved with during my PhD, as mostly cooperative stuff with StarCraft and so on. Yeah, these days I've expanded a bit. So one thing I'm doing, I'm chairing this for agent-based modeling community, which is trying to sort of diffuse AI knowledge into various disciplines, and then also try to get problems from various disciplines back into the AI community to make sure like our AI research stays grounded in proper research problems. And we had our first, so we're running a reading group that everybody's invited to. It's bi-weekly, it's in Oxford and remote, and also we just had our first major workshop at ICML, and there's hopefully going to be another one at ICLR in May. So that was my AI researcher hat. Now my climate policy hat is coming from a history of, in parallel, also working in climate policy. So first with Professor Myles Allen, one of the lead authors of the SR15 report on 1.5 degree warming. And then now at the moment, I'm visiting researcher with Yoshua, who hopefully you still remember from last week. And I'm also advisor for the AI for Global Climate Cooperation. And this year also I was selected to be part of this Schmidt Futures International Strategy Forum as like 30 or 35 Rising Strategists Europe. And that has been very exciting because it's sort of like introduced me to a lot of contemporary geopolitics, and this talk is going to be informed by my experiences. I've also worked like as a consultant on the intersection of AI and climate, various problems, trying to get the community to work more on solar geoengineering, so it doesn't become some sort of silver bullet technology bet kind of thing for the policymaking community, because people are starting to talk about this and there are just limits to what we can do, and I think it's important to treat this properly. I've dabbled in politics as well. Right now I don't have enough time, but yeah, I've been quite serious about local politics in all sorts of ways, and this is also informing a lot of things that I'm going to try to bring to your attention today in my talk. I've also worked recently on the intersection of climate policy and deep multi-agent learning. This is like one project. So here we were this together with some folks from economics, from Oxford mostly, some think tanks. We were looking at CEOs of fossil fuel companies because in fact, so the valuation of these companies still like hinges on their undeveloped reserves and so on. But if they were to develop all the reserves, then clearly we would not limit global warming to safe levels. And so the question is like, is there going to be a tipping point where companies that have not undergone the green energy transition will become worthless in a small amount of time? And we were exploring this through some war game first that was played with like experts. And then actually I joined the project afterwards, and we're trying to solve this with deep multi-agent learning. And that has been a very interesting experience. And some of the tricks we use there, I think might also be applicable today. For example, like this leak system that we used, I'll get back to that in a bit. Yeah, also this idea of using exogenous scenarios maybe. So we had like a wide breadth of exogenous scenarios. And the takeaway from the project was a bit, at least our model was indicating that there's like, no matter what kind of future you think there's gonna be in terms of like degree warming by 2100, it's always best actually for majors to like decarbonize as quickly as possible. And there's obviously, and even take out debt now to do it. The argument for it is very complex. Why it does not hold in the real world is also a complex thing. And some of the reasons is Russia's invasion of Ukraine now, of course, which has sort of like, driven oil prices up and so on. And this is also how geopolitics comes into stuff. And I will actually talk about how geopolitics comes into AI4GCC a bit later. Okay, having given an overview of where I'm coming from, I'm now going to talk a little bit about the competition. So as you may know from the white paper, we are modeling 27 different fictitious entities that are somewhat fictitious and somewhat like, based on conglomerates of real world regions. Yeah, it's again, like it's a sequential game, and at each step, each of these entities can make decisions. They can offer negotiation, like contracts, and they can decide to agree or not agree on contracts. And they can also like choose to mitigate certain amounts or save certain amounts for the future, or spend that money now for to improve technology. They can also set up tariffs and so on. And then all these actions are being fed into this climate simulator RICE-N, which is a multi-agent version of RICE. And RICE, some of you might know DICE, which was developed by William Nordhaus. There's a Nobel Prize in Economics attached to it, and it's basically a regionally resolved version of DICE. Okay, and then and I'm not going to talk about the internals of DICE. I'll get back to that a little bit later at the end of the talk. But DICE includes both like some sort of physical climate component, and it also includes like some modeling of the economy and so on. Okay, then there are 3 different tracks in this competition. The first one is score-based, so it basically means take the simulator yeah, just optimize the score. So that's more of an AI kind of thing. And I'm going to focus on that right now. And for this, I'm just putting on the head of an AI researcher. So I'm not actually concerned about any real-world implications of what I'm doing, but I'm just saying, how would I solve this if I was approaching this from an AI researcher for track 1? First thing is I would automate a mechanism design. So this is a mechanism design problem. For those of you who have seen Stefan's paper on AI Economist, it's kind of the same thing. I would definitely automate the search over negotiation strategies and so on as far as you can. I think the winning entry will do that. Here's one tip for the outer loop. Maybe use something that does not require gradients flowing through the inner loop. Depending on how you're doing it, you could use something that's gradient free evolution strategies. That's something that my lab has been exploring quite a bit in the recent past. Second sort of bag of tricks is concerning symmetry breaking. So we're in a general sum game. We want to make sure we converge, as Andrew has brought up, to some interesting equilibria. Some ways of doing this is like we could use this league-based learning system where agents play against sort of a population of previously trained agents. Also against some exploiter agents, so that basically can break symmetry. But there are more principled ways of doing this, and one of them is unsupervised environment design. Again, like my lab has been involved in this somewhat. And yeah, this is just for inspiration. Robustness, so I don't know if this track actually requires any kind of robustness to initial starting conditions, but I personally think, and also in 2DP, like we took great care in like noising initial starting conditions and so on, like doing some sort of a domain randomization, to make things more robust, and not like break down when like, any sort of parameters change. Exploitability is also can be an issue when you do self-play in general. Like you might overfit to like specific populations of agents. So but then if you evaluate with like other agents, then it might all not be so well. You might be exploitable and so on. So to prevent this, again, like two ways you could do. There might be others, league-based learning. So in our 2DP project, we had some exploiter agents that were doing like business as usual or like delayed transitions. So they were sort of learned but constrained to be within certain parameters to make sure, we have this common sense check of like, okay, these very specific, simple strategies that we see in the real world, basically, cannot exploit whatever we are learning. And here, like, we could have some free riding policies or whatnot, like you can think of things. Alternatively, or in combination with this, we could look at a more of a counterfactual regret minimization problem. There's a huge body of work on diplomacy, particularly in meta AI. And here you're basically trying to minimize the some exploitability metric or some approximation thereof directly. If you really have too much compute, this is a paper that's fresh off the press, and Andrew sent it to me first, then you could go down the route that Meta has been going and actually solving this board game diplomacy. And this time they actually have done it with press. So that means like agents can communicate in natural language with each other about like, and the plot and so on, what they're going to do, in which country, they're going to move in and so on. And yeah, it takes a lot of compute. It takes probably a team of engineers. But the nice thing would be that you could play Ryzen with humans potentially. So that might be nice. But again, probably overkill for most people entering this competition. Okay, so that was my AI researcher take on AI4GCC, and I'm going to focus both on track 2 and track 3. So track 2 is about score and real-world relevance, and track 3 is critiques and improvements, very broadly critiques and simulator and so on, the whole project. I don't know. I'm going to and particularly the sim to real gap, is like the thing. So we have a simulation. What does that tell us about the real world? How is the simulation different from the real world, and so on? And for this, I'm going to put on my policymaker's hat. And let's start by talking about like how real world climate negotiation actually look like. And I think a good starting point is like to think about like where is climate being negotiated? And we all know these conference of parties. There was one in Egypt now that has kind of mixed results, if you ask me. Interestingly, there is also a lot of climate policy being done at different levels, different gremiums, different subgroups of states like G7, G20, or 19, depending. There's a Bonn conference that maybe some of you know about. It's sort of like anti-cyclical with the COPs. But also climate policy is frankly being made in EU Parliament or national parliaments or Congress, US Congress, and so on. And one thing I'm going to be arguing for a bit in this presentation is that it actually seems as if a lot of international climate negotiation is actually done on the streets. And I'll get back to that, why it looks increasingly as if that was the case. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the big players, so you all get like, some picture of like how things are going. So here's China. China is now the largest emitter, 27% of emissions. It's also one of the largest investors in clean energy. And it's a leading player in green tech, and it controls a lot of the supply chain of solar energy. It's also very vulnerable to climate change, and this presumably has also led it to be like a major player, the Paris Agreement, COP26, and so on. So it's also very involved in climate policy, very progressive in climate policy. On the other level, it actually hasn't implemented its NDC, so it's not its nationally determined contributions. So it's not actually like sticking to what it has agreed to at the COPs in terms of emissions reduction. And now we have this very peculiar situation where Nancy Pelosi just visited Taiwan, and then right now at least, it seems very uncertain what things China is committing to or not. And sort of the whole situation has become a bit icy, particularly between China and the US. I'm going to talk about this a bit later. Then we have the US. As you may all know, it's kind of politically polarized at the moment. Nevertheless, Biden is striving to regain climate leadership, but he can only really achieve this by focusing on domestic economic advantage. And one side effect of this is that like he's not willing to talk about penalizing fossil fuel use. So it's kind of a bit limited. And nevertheless, we had this Inflation Reduction Act is actually pumping a lot of money in terms of tax breaks into the green transition, and it's probably going to be pretty transformative, to be honest. Downside is, though, that even though there is climate action domestically, the Congress is not really willing to support major international climate financing. We will talk about later why this is a problem. Europe has traditionally been, particularly the EU, has particularly been like a leader in particularly coming up with carbon pricing, emissions trading systems, and so on. They're going to run their carbon border adjustment mechanism from next year. And the idea of this is you create some sort of protected economy that creates incentives for production processes that are less carbon intensive for steel, cement, and so on. And then everybody who is trying to sell more carbon intensive products on that market pays some tariff or something. And this has been expanded actually to a sort of climate club idea together with the UK, US, Japan, other G7 countries. The problem is all of this is wildly unpopular with any countries who believe that they might not be able to transition fast enough. This includes low and mid-income countries, so they feel they're just being kept off those markets. They feel it's very protectionist. And so we have seen a practice that a climate club, so basically what's being talked about in terms of where the climate club is going to go, it's not really a climate club anymore, because there's no consensus of carbon pricing, of course, between the EU and most other G7 countries. So sort of climate clubs doesn't really seem to be taking off right now. We've got Russia. Well, Russia has interestingly started committing to carbon neutrality by 2060 last year. And the rumor is that this is probably because both they're fearing this carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is wanting to introduce or is going to introduce, but also because there's more visible damage now from melting permafrost. Obviously now after the invasion of Ukraine, there's not, like, climate policy is not the most important thing on the agenda right now. I formulated like this for Russia, and also there's sort of a reduced willingness for international cooperation. So Russia is kind of a bit out at the moment, I'd say. Right, emerging markets, and I'm excluding China and Russia because there's some contention over whether China and Russia are parts of emerging markets or not. But focusing on the other ones, they're actually contributing lots of emissions, but they're also falling well short of Paris goals. And because they're focusing on industrial development, right? The problem is they would need a lot of resources to undergo the green transition, but they can't really attract the investment because they have poor credit ratings, because at least they're perceived to be relatively unstable. And so they require substantial climate finance. We've just seen US is not really willing to do that right now. So it's adding to the problems. Lower income countries, on the other hand, they're actually starting to really feel the effects of climate change. And for them, climate adaptation measures are probably as important as emissions mitigation at this point. And at the same point, they have kind of lost faith in multilateral institutions and sort of the global climate negotiation process. And to be honest, the COVID-19 vaccine inequality didn't really help with this. And there's just increasing resentment in global inequality and so on. You can really feel that at climate negotiations. It's also a major problem. So apart from all these sort of global holistic approaches to climate negotiation, we've seen a bunch of so-called like-minded or even sectorial initiatives spring up. One of them is a breakthrough agenda that was initiated last year in Glasgow. And it's an initiative by the European Union and a few other states on creating initiatives in certain sectors like transportation and so on. And to be honest, the G7 Climate Club is sort of deteriorating into a breakthrough agenda style thing right now because, as I said, like, we can't really get agreement on carbon pricing and so on. So countries are looking for sort of lower level scopes right now. Then there's also these just energy transition partnerships that are picking up, and these are more direct agreements between developed and developing countries on sort of joint initiatives leading to decarbonization of certain sectors or certain aspects in projects. And these are sort of like also picking up. And one question we would have for the competition is how would we model such initiatives? That's something I would love to see in submissions. Apart from all these sort of national level initiatives, we also have non-party stakeholders, and their number is growing. Maybe right now they don't play too much of a role, but their number is growing. And this is really a mix of different actors. So we have subnational governments like California or Oxfordshire, and we have companies such as Unilever and maybe Shell, depending who you ask. Then we have institutions like green finance, green banks, and even individuals like Al Gore. Question is also, can we model this somehow? Can we introduce this to AI4GCC somehow? Should we, and what role would it play? Really interesting question. So overall, we can say, I think, that climate negotiations in 2020 is a regime complex where UNFCCC is somewhere in the middle. Then we have some other UN institutions that are kind of involved, like UNIDO. We have public-private partnerships. We have sectoral corporations, and we have corporations between like-minded countries. So there's like a lot of stuff going on. And actually, AI4GCC is wonderfully decentralized. So that actually seems to be a trend right now. And then the big question is, how do I actually link in all these more like decentralized initiatives with like the big picture, right? And this is something I also like to see in the competition. Like, this is a very hot question. How can we align these things? Now, I want to ask, having talked about a bit like how structurally these climate negotiations look like and who are like the main players and so on, I want to talk a little bit about like what actually shapes the climate negotiation process, right? And so I have different shapes here. So first one is trust. I'm going to talk about like what is trust in this context. Geopolitics, I've given some examples, but I want to talk a bit more about this as well. Climate justice, what's that about? Group effects and peer pressure. Sounds kind of wild. And then my favorite maybe is this question of collective action problems. So is are climate negotiations, international climate negotiations, really about free riding concerns? Yeah, am I really not increasing my negotiation, my ambitions if I see that somebody else is not doing it? And actually, I will be arguing in this talk that this is not really the case, but it's actually domestic politics that much more drives international climate negotiations. And this is somewhat controversial, but I'll explain. Okay, first of all, trust in climate justice. So the only reason that Paris Agreement came about was pretty much because some high-income countries ganged up with some low-income countries, and together they formed this high ambition coalition, and they really like drove the Paris Agreement. The problem is now we've had a few events that have led to decreased trust between low-income countries and high-income countries. So COVID vaccine inequality. Then we've had some adaptation funds that were set up last year, and they have only been like paid out. Only 50% have been allocated. So there's a problem with climate finance. Climate finance is perceived to not like really coming, and that's really feeding into this perception of climate injustice in low-income countries, perhaps understandably so. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, has also led to tensions. So there's like fuel and food inflation going on, low-income countries, and there's a lot of disinformation and all these kind of things. So not like kind of the best conditions right now for repeating this sort of process. And then the question is like, how could we model this in AI4GCC, right? So this idea of trust is maybe something we could do through reciprocity, and this is also a conceptual thing in multi-agent learning, deep multi-agent learning. But I really think like we might have to feed in some historical context potentially, right? And then climate finance. So there are no direct actions, I think, right now that would sort of enable the transfer of money between different actors. Maybe you could do it indirectly. Maybe you can set negative tariffs. I have no idea. But yeah, maybe we would want to expand this by allowing for sort of climate finance, direct climate finance actions. Next block, geopolitics. I'm just throwing stuff, So geopolitics, the end of globalization, question mark. I don't know. We will see, but it looks like it. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, energy security concerns are shooting up. This huge food and energy price inflation in low-income countries, and Russia shows little interest in climate policy. But that's arguably maybe a transitional thing. But the longer-term game seems to be this growing rivalry between China and the US. And there is a huge competition over green tech supply chain, which China owns to a large extent. And there's also, frankly, right now, there's a bit of an ice age because of tensions surrounding Taiwan. And this rivalry, there is no end in sight. So this can go for a long time, and we don't have that much time, when it comes to reducing global warming to safe levels. So the question is, can we somehow feed this into our simulation in some way? There's peer pressure and other sort of like group effects. So just to explain, the idea of this Paris Agreement was a bit, and also the Conference of Parties was a bit, you have these international climate negotiators, like you bring them all into a room and they have to deliver. So like at these conferences, these events, like you have a certain amount of peer pressure, countries want to be perceived as leaders and so on. And so like they agree to targets that they maybe later wish they wouldn't have agreed to, but then the idea is they would never let us try to comply with them. So there's a sort of this peer pressure effect. And this has worked arguably to an extent. So for example, Biden has been announcing new targets last year that are pretty competitive. It also hasn't worked to some extent. So India and China, as I already said, like, they're not, they're expected or projected to exceed their NDCs. And yeah, so there seem to be other things going on that are influencing their climate policy decisions. Nevertheless, can we model such effects in AI4GCC? Yeah, just another question. I'll wrap it in the end as well, all the different things. Now, maybe my favorite topic, climate negotiations, is it really about like a collective action problem? Is it really a prisoner's dilemma? So the traditional view, and I'm talking here, is also the view that the creator of Rice N, I think, had, and so on, is climate negotiations are dominated by a collective action problem. And so actually, they're like three principles, you know, like anyone who free rides, so is trying to cash in, but is not willing to put in the investment, should be punished in climate negotiations. And then also you would expect that countries only pass climate policies reciprocally. So that basically means if one country does something, they will only do something if other countries also do this. And one conclusion from this would be that if one of the pivotal players does not reciprocate climate action, then you would start seeing others to defect. So if the US like decided to pull out, which it has done, you know, at various points, you would really expect that other players would also pull out. Yet this isn't really backed up by empirical facts. And this is relatively recent. So this is a paper that sort of kicked off this whole thing. It's very well cited now. And they actually looked at specific episodes in past climate negotiations. And they were trying to test this hypothesis that climate negotiations really are a collective action problem. And actually the strength of empirical evidence that I found was very weak, even for the hypothesis that it's like weakly influencing climate negotiation. But they had an alternative hypothesis, which is called the distributive conflict hypothesis, that actually seemed to be pretty solid. So what is this distributive conflict about? Well, it's this idea that on a national level, the climate transition creates winners and losers, right? It's affecting all parts of the economy. It's affecting most parts of society, or all parts of society. There are winners and losers. And these winners and losers obviously are engaging in a political process. At least of some of the major countries in the world, the democracy in the world, but arguably most countries. This then leads to domestic struggles between pro-climate and anti-climate factions. And in fact, whether countries put out more ambitious targets in climate conferences or not seems to be mostly correlated with whether they domestically have pro-climate or anti-climate factions in power. And I must say, as a politician, that also sort of like lines up with like what I'm observing, right? Like you vote, like, you know, if like, I don't know, a green party of some sort, a progressive party comes in power, you know, the voters tend to expect them to, you know, take a lead in these climate negotiations. And this question of like, is the concern about free riding doesn't seem to be particularly strong. But anyway, so I think, you know, it's still out there. These are relatively recent developments. But nevertheless, can we model domestic policies in AI4GCC? Is that something we could potentially do? There's another reason, though, why climate negotiations may not be a prisoner's dilemma. And this is the simple fact that renewable energy costs have really come down much more quickly than most even scenarios by the International Energy Agency are predicting. And here you can see there's some recent work from Oxford from Oxford economists that you can see these red lines here. These are like sort of past forecasts. This is for solar energy. And actually, then you see like empirically grounded estimates. And you can see that actually empirically grounded estimates are like actually much more beneficial. And so the question is, the result of this is that renewable energy transition is more or less a self-interested decision these days, right? So I really like want to go green because it's actually cheaper, and it's getting cheaper way faster than we have predicted. Now the question is, can I sort of integrate this into AI4GCC? Do I need to or not? Does RISE do this yet or not? I'll put it out there. I actually don't know. Summarizing all these different parts of the puzzle, I think for track 2, you should at least reflect on all these different things, and potentially you can put some constraints on your solution findings, on your objective that respect some of these constraints, and then argue, you know, why your solution is sort of practically relevant. Now for track 3, it gets potentially much more interesting because you can start really implementing these things. You can open the bonnet of RISE, and you can try to stick some stuff in and change the equations. You can take an entirely different simulator. One thing that I would like to put out there is like it might be an opportunity to look into like how can we fix RISE, because as we will see and argue a little bit about this in a second, RISE is pretty broken, and we know that this is broken. It doesn't mean we know how to fix it ideally, although I would say there are a few ways that we know what should be fixed, but it's not being done for several reasons. But yeah, I think this would be an opportunity also, like, to tap into common criticism of RISE and maybe see, what needs to be done or not. But I'll talk about this in a little second. So now I'm going to put on my magician's head and I'm going to look into my crystal ball about like what could be impact of AI4GCC, and it's a mix of what I expect to happen potentially and also what I would love to see. So road to impact, lots of different ideas floating around how impact could be achieved. Let's start with the first one. So impact on institutions. So I think this competition could gain some insight on institutional design, right? How should climate negotiations be designed, particularly decentralized and so on? Only problem is institutional reform has proven extremely slow. There are a lot of pretty simple suggestions with actually a lot of support on how current climate negotiations could be changed, and we just see that nevertheless reform takes ages. There could be space for new initiatives, of course, as climate negotiations, real climate negotiations already get more decentralized. Maybe there will be some inspiration for some new initiatives, like-minded initiatives, or even like sort of private initiatives. So this is all within the realm of like what I would potentially expect for this competition to yield, and what I would be excited about. Now, as I said, fixing RISE. So there's this sort of situation that integrated assessment models in general. Research seems to be slightly underfunded, at least like that's my personal view. You may disagree. And I think this competition could be a bit of a stress test for RISE. So I actually expect RISE to fail in a number of ways. I'm happy to discuss later in this competition. And maybe we get some insight on how to fix it. And maybe we can get some spotlight on the necessity of improving integrated assessment models. And I think that would be really good for the field. I've linked to very prominent criticisms of RISE here. Impact on climate litigation, that's a little bit more speculative. I don't know if that's really relevant or not, but there's this process going on that's called climate litigation. These are actually court cases against emitters. So the argument goes, and this is going back to sort of tobacco litigation in the 1970s, where this sort of like judicial procedure was established. It's like, okay, company X has emitted Y% of greenhouse gases historically, and so they have to now pay Y% of the adaptation of damage costs. And what you need to do in these cases is you need to establish causation. So you need to prove that there is a causal connection between this extra greenhouse gas amount that was pumped in the atmosphere and the resulting adaptation damages. And this can only be done most of the time with physical climate models. And these models and arguments get better and better. So much so that like some of these cases now are actually in the evidentiary phase. So basically these models are being admitted as evidence in court. Now, in terms of agent-based models now, with the 2DP project, so we are thinking at the moment whether we can strike some connection. So in some countries, not the US, but in some countries like UK, for example, there are responsibility. Actually, I think it's not a company act, it's the Company Act, UK Company Act, not Climate Act, sorry about that. And they enshrine certain long-term responsibilities for company CEOs. So not just ecological responsibilities, but long-term responsibilities. And the question is, if we have an agent-based model of strategic decision-making, we can show that the current decisions that the CEOs are making are not working out in the long term, they're bound to fail in the long term, would there be a path to using such models as evidence in court? And obviously, this is going to be a super tedious process. And again, it's going to take a lot of time. We don't have so much time. We will see. In terms of using something like RISE-N, I'm a bit more careful because I don't really know what the legal basis would be at this point, but I nevertheless think somebody who knows more about law than I do might want to look at this. It might nevertheless be interesting for sort of publicly pointing out what certain countries' negotiation strategies might lead to if we can make this whole AI4GCC competition sufficiently close to the real world. So maybe that's sort of a more speculative road of impact I would love to see, but don't quite know how to get there. Love to hear your opinions in the discussion. Impact on education. This is something that's very well achievable, I think, and also something I would love to see. So I think the whole AI4GCC competition, I think it's really well advertised. I think it's really nice. I think it can teach people a lot about climate negotiation process. It creates attention and so on. I think this can be used in schools potentially, educational videos and so on. And also there's this route which I find pretty funny, but I don't know how impactful it actually is. There's this game, Fate of the World, where you're like in the role of like some fictitious global corporate, like global institution, and your task is basically to take all these decisions, all these policy cards and whatever, like ranging through all different sectors of the economy and then the strata of society, on like decarbonizing the world essentially. I could imagine that maybe AI4GCC, could lead to some browser game or whatever that people can play, to like immerse themselves in it could even be part of some metaverse or whatever's whatever's going on these days. Impact on education, I think definitely something to explore. And as a politician, I would love to see some impact on the narrative. So this idea that climate change or climate negotiations is sort of it's a prisoner's dilemma, and that it is really about like free riding concerns, and if country X can do whatever they want, but if country Y doesn't do anything, and then also like there are like all these like kind of not very accurate narratives about like what China's doing or not doing, and whether then Germany should do something or whatnot. So at the doorstep, like I experience a lot of this. If we could use AI4GCC some way to like work on those narratives, then that could have some really good impact on domestic policy, on domestic politics as well. Sort of closing the circle. And that's it for me. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
That's great. Thank you very much, Christian. That was an excellent talk. It was a whirlwind through a bunch of stuff, and it was really quite educational. I learned a lot myself. Feel like it really opened up my thought processes around this issue. So it was a very good talk. Thank you. If anyone in the audience has questions, you can just add them to the Q&A or the chat, or if you want to talk, you can raise your hand. Maybe I'll go through some of the questions that I had just to get us started. And so recently I was talking actually to a political economist I was at the AI Symposium on climate change, and there was a political economist there, and basically what they said to me was that they would eat their hat if I mentioned Nash equilibria to like a policymaker, right? And so maybe my first question for you that would be interesting is, you talked about how it's not really a prisoner's dilemma, or that doesn't seem to be the real focus of it. And so my question is game theory still an interesting inferential framework for these types of things? Should we be looking at other aspects of game theory, or should we be shifting away from game theory itself when trying to understand these issues?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. That also, like, we will see, and this is why AI4GCC is so interesting, because it allows us to explore this space in a way that it hasn't been explored before. So I can see a certain tiredness in terms of coming up with like really wild abstraction of real world systems, and then doing some traditional game theoretic applications to it, and then trying to conclude anything about the real world. And this does not only stretch climate negotiations. Opportunity that we have now is to create much more complex simulations, and that could really make a difference, because we can model nonlinear effects, we can model temporal extension, large state spaces, and so on. And I think that we don't know yet where this could lead. But as you said, like, it really depends on this like sim to reality gap in many ways, which is like, how good is my model with respect to the questions that I'm trying to ask, right? But I could see that there's an opportunity, this sort of counterfactual scenario analysis, and I think that could really like open up people's perception of what kind of futures are possible. It's really about like, the model has to be right, and then like it's a lot of engineering, and I think we don't know right now. So it's really good that we are exploring this now. It could really change with the new capabilities that we have. But yeah, I'm also encountering a lot of this sort of tiredness in the policymaker community.
Yeah, definitely. Great. That's very cool. Hopefully Raisen can help us answer some of these questions and figure out, like, does it make sense, or like, how do we grow now? How do we evolve? And I guess maybe that relates to another question that I had that was more on the side of multi-agent reinforcement learning itself. And so you're part of like one of the sort of like the best labs in the world on multi-agent reinforcement learning. You guys are sort of like doing the pioneering work of like pushing forward and figuring out like, okay, not only like how do we sort of like build these things, but like in case the audience isn't aware, multi-agent reinforcement learning is not easy. It's a tough subject. And so I guess I was wondering, like, what do you think constitute interesting results right now in multi-agent reinforcement learning? Or what do you think are the main obstacles to closing essentially that like sim to real gap so that, Marl can have like a more impact on reality?
Yeah, that's excellent. And again, like I would like to put on two different hats here. So from an AI researcher's head, what we're concerned with is, do we find good solutions in whatever simulations we construct? There are a lot of open method problems and like how to scale methods to large general sum games. So there's a lot to be done there. And also to derive more like theoretical guarantees in terms of then the impact. So even if you have solved a certain simulation to an extent that we are happy with as AI researchers, if I put on my policymaker hat, there are so many things I need to address on top of that I hope that some people will start addressing for in the context of AI4GCC. So this has to do with, for example, we see in the economics community, they really want to see theoretical guarantees. They're like, well, you're solving, you're trying to solve this game, but you have no guarantees that you're like optimal in your solutions. You don't have guarantee that you find the right equilibria and so on, or that you're like robust. And there's this sim to real gap, of course, where you can always claim that the real world is somehow significantly different from your simulated world. And there are like all these concerns. And then in the end, obviously, decision makers want to have some insight and some introspection into how decisions are derived. But I think it's a huge opportunity also to build things that are more interactive, that allow people to play around with the simulations and so on. I think there's a lot there that can actually be addressed, and in order to build up trust also, even if we are convinced as AI researchers that something works and actually use the insights, like, you need to build up the trust with decision makers to actually then start using it. There's a lot we can do, frankly, at this point.
Great. That's awesome. We have a hand raised from our audience. Christoph, I see. Stefan, if you're able to unmute him so that he can ask his question.
So first of all, thank you also very much, Christian, for that talk. It was absolutely amazing and very stimulating on many different levels. So I have a question regarding both of your hats and multi-agent reinforcement learning. And that is, so I think many people still think of machine learning, and particularly a subject as complex as this, as a sort of like black box models, and you don't really know necessarily what's going on inside them. So, so from the domain of explainable AI, do you know of any techniques that are particularly useful for demonstrating that, or like for convincing ourselves and policymakers that these agents have learned something useful and may not just be like overfitting on particular aspects of the model and like exploiting parts of it?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. That also opens a very wide field. So there are obviously a lot of methods. It's a very busy field, explainable AI. There are lots of methods that, like, I don't know, saliency maps and then improvements thereof and whatever, that show you like what parts of your input your networks are focusing on and so on. So you can use all that, but actually I'm more traditional. I like good old ablation studies. So basically, like, you play around with certain aspects, like you remove or add certain aspects of your simulation. You try to connect this to maybe situations that you can treat somehow analytically, for example, and then, like, you see, you convince yourself that like whatever results you get like kind of makes sense, and that the effects that you find are not like spurious. And I think this is like, it's basically experiment design. Like, you need to design the right tests of your model and implementation, and that's very domain specific. So I'm afraid I don't think this will ever change.
Well, thank you.
Cool. We also have a comment in the QA section, and I'm kind of curious to get your sort of your reaction to this. And so basically, Funimo Katana says that just a comment that when mentioning India, China, and Russia's emission situation, it's also important to mention that the United States emits 15.5 tons of emissions per capita, while India only has 2, Russia has 11.5, and China has 7.4.
Absolutely.
And so it's hard to say that United States are leading the front on climate mitigation.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I'm sorry if they came across as if I thought that they would. I think what I was meaning to say was just that they're trying to come across as leaders. And I think this is an excellent point. Thanks a lot for raising this. Yeah, it's just like, in the absolute scale of emissions, it's just, basically makes clear that we really have to get middle-income countries on board if we want to achieve our overall Paris targets. That's basically, yeah. Thanks a lot for raising this. Very, very important.
Definitely, yeah. Very good, great comment, great response. I think we're all on the same page. Yeah. Stefan, did you want to say something about this? I see that it says you'd like to answer the question live.
That's the Zoom feature.
Yeah, that's the Zoom feature, exactly.
So we've answered the question live.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, I understand. Okay, okay, it's answered. Anyways, okay, done. Okay, yeah, there's another question, which is just, can you share the slides with the audience after the talk? Which
absolutely,
I would
yeah,
also
all of
like
this.
to thumbs up this, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, very happy to, and I would love to see participants in this competition to sort of like, go through the slides and use them as sort of like, make some ticks in the checkbox for their responses for the jury. Yeah, if this could help people, build up on, yeah, that would be awesome. I'd love to see that. Yeah, please use freely.
I think I think participants could definitely benefit. You were very generous with your insights into how to the alternate title for the talk was appropriately chosen. So it's very cool.
Yeah. No,
nice.
there's a lot of other applications as well of AI to climate policy that I encourage everybody to explore as well. Yeah, and I just noticed that I'm actually much more narrow, and I didn't want to. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, there's a lot of applications. Yeah, there's another question that says like about emissions. Another question is how to take into account exports and imports of carbon emissions. For example, Europe is importing a lot of goods from China. So maybe like how does that accounting work in your mind, or do you see ways to implement that in Ryzen? Like how would that be valuable or work? Okay,
so I mean, there's this idea of tariffs on higher like the products that have been created. Like basically, every product you think about, like particular emissions intensive product like steel or cement. When we import that, we can sort of try and add some sort of emissions to that, and then we can implement tariffs at the border when we import these goods. And obviously, EU and so on, they have started exploring this. I think in AI4GCC there is we can actually set tariffs. I don't know if they are sort of sectorial or whether there's any resolution on the specific goods. I don't think necessarily that's implemented, so that's something you could implement. But I think the aspect that's super important is that whenever I, as a high-income country, decide to set something up like this, it also means I'm excluding other players from the market. Right. And if I don't couple this with climate finance that allows, for example, mid or low income countries to decarbonize, then actually, this really triggers a feeling of injustice. And we've seen this very recently. And so this always has to be accompanied by climate finance, arguably. And I think that's a really important connection there. But yeah, this can be implemented in several ways. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I think that would be a great submission for track 3 for figuring out how to augment, say, the market system that we have for the international trade within the simulator to see, like, can we sort of implement that, or can we create that, I don't know, the link between, imports and exports and what specific products emit how many carbon emissions and et cetera, et cetera. Basically adding granularity to how tariffs work with exports and imports. That could be very cool. Yeah, so thank you. That's a cool answer. Maybe while waiting for more questions from the crowd, I have one that's more related to you. I mean, as your talk highlighted, there can often be a pretty big gap between, like, say, researchers and policymakers, and it's not always obvious how researchers can actually like look towards making a political impact or getting involved. So, I mean, you've said you're involved in politics, you work a lot on the policy side. So how would you encourage people to get involved in this policy space and work towards making this impact that goes beyond just the research?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's obviously many ways of sort of achieving that. I think one thing you can always do is, like, if you're in an academic context in particular, you can just go to different departments. You know, there are sometimes, like for me, for example, there was like a School of Climate Change in Oxford that I participated in, which was a series of like talks and discussions with like experts in Oxford, and that was really, really helpful, like for me to get started with this whole field. And this is really important. Like, it's really important to spend time with the different communities in order to understand like how they communicate, what the issues are, what the unknown unknowns are. And I don't think there is a substitute to that. Obviously, if you are personally interested in taking this further, if you are curious about how it is to be a politician and so on, like, you know, you can also start like joining local parties or do some campaigning or work with political NGOs and so on. But that really like depends on how much time you have and how curious you are about this. For me, it was always a bit like I always had these like two different legs, and for a while it seemed as if they had nothing to do with each other. And now basically I just feel like, you know, that it enables me to tackle these different problems from like two very different sides, and I'm not forced to necessarily make connections that are natural, and that's a good position to be in. But yeah, in my case, it's been pretty organic and undirected, but I think you can approach this more strategically if you spend time with like these communities and just ask them questions, and yeah, they will also benefit a lot from like your knowledge and advice. That's
great, thank you. I don't see any raised hands or questions, so I'm just going to keep going because, you know, like I do enjoy talking with you, and I will pick your brain given the opportunity. So why not? You know, one of the sort of interesting comments that I think, like I heard you mention, was that Russia had made this promise for carbon neutrality by 2060, and you were like speculating at reasons for why they were doing this, you know, and there was this idea like the fear of the carbon border adjustment, but also this idea of like the visible damage from permafrost. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of brought into my mind is like, maybe there's this sort of gap or almost this like this tragedy where people don't necessarily see what climate change is going to hold for them in the future until they actually see the effects, you know. And so maybe the idea for that is like, how do we bring that future into the present, essentially, mm-hmm. You know, that this idea of the tragedy of the horizon, that people are not going to deal with this problem until they visibly see the effects, at which point it might be too late, you know. Mm-hmm. So maybe like how do you see that problem being addressed? How do you see that being fixed? How do you see it fitting into RICE N? Basically just an open-ended question for what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, excellent question, Andrew. I wished I had a comprehensive answer. I'll try my best to maybe talk about a few aspects of this. So first of all, RICE N, I think one of the major contentions is about this discount factor. And the original RICE suggestions or suggestions by Nordhaus were to choose discount factors that are sort of aligned with market economies. And I think they were going up to 3%. Now, if I'm choosing 3%, then that means that 25 years down the road, basically I have a 50% discount. So anything that happens in 25 years, like I care about half as much as I do today. I think it is hard to sort of marry that discount factor choice with the idea of intergenerational justice. I think it's just very hard. I think it just doesn't work, to be honest. So I don't think we should probably think about discount factors at all. So that's like, you know, that's like one part. So this is like, you know, we need to get away from these discount factors because they play a very different role in the market economy, I would argue. The other thing is that, so I know, for example, Yoshua has this excellent project on visualizing climate change effects, and where, like, you know, you basically you take some pictures and then, like, you know, you generate floods around them and so on. And I think this is actually pretty great. I just think that people, to really be emotionally affected, it has to be really brought to an individual level. It like kind of needs to really, like, people really need to feel like individually threatened, because a reason why people often don't necessarily take climate action and so on is due to existential considerations, right? Like they feel like they don't have the resources to do that. They, for example, like I was talking a lot to like CEOs of like German SMEs, and these are like people who are very responsible, I would say, on the whole scale, sort of like, you know, so German Mittelstand is like quite renowned for having sort of a longer term perspective and the sort of family ownership and so on. But they were saying, you know, like we could do a lot about decarbonization, like at this point, like it was like, you know, switching from oil to gas, or you know, paying for eco electricity and so on. But we're not doing it because it's not even like mildly profitable, or it's not even like sort of a like a net zero thing, like in terms of finances for us, profits for us. The problem is if we start pricing this into our products, then we will get competition from places like Vietnam or East Africa and so on, and that could lead to outsourcing. And once our business has been outsourced, it's not just that's bad for us, but it's also in these places there's no enforcement in terms of like any kind of climate regulations. So and I'm just saying this is a narrative. I'm not saying that I agree with this. I think it's very hard and very intransparent, like but also obviously they know their business best, right? Like so it's hard to know if anyone knows whether that's true or not. But to what degree, what situation. But this is a very common narrative. So people actually do what they can, even if they're long-term minded. But there's a existential threshold, and these are people who are pretty rich, right? They're pretty wealthy. Obviously, most people on this planet are not, and so like they need to think much more day to day, on how to feed their children and so on. So
Definitely, yeah. It seems to tie into your idea of like changing the narrative, right? Because that sounds like a very prisoner's dilemma-y way to think, where like I have to think on this task, because if I don't, well, then the other person is just going to take advantage of it, and we're going to get competition from some faceless adversary halfway across the globe to which my business is going to be outsourced.
Well, classic argument, classic argument is like if Germany was to do more, China is not doing it, so there will be catastrophic climate change anyway, right? And completely like ignoring the fact that China is actually doing a lot on climate change in some ways,
exactly,
so there's a lot of like
things
that globalization itself has not fixed in terms of narratives, right?
Exactly. We have a question from Tianyu actually, where he is asking if you can give an example of modeling the fairness between countries.
That's a very good question. I was hoping nobody would.
Good luck.
Ask. Yeah, I would love to just leave that to participants of this competition, of course. On top of my head, I actually don't have a specific reference. And actually preparing those slides, I was actually realizing a lot also like, how many things I actually would like to look up over the next weeks. So here's an offer. If you find something, can you share it with all of us? And can we have a discussion on how to best implement these things? Nice. That would be awesome.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. I remember it's actually a fairly contentious issue. I was talking to an expert in climate justice, right? Like this is they're a scholar in climate justice, and we were sort of asking like, okay, well, how do we factor climate justice into the simulator? Like, what do we do for that? And like one of the things they mentioned that sort of made me blink twice was, well, if you look at the track record of COP meetings, generally they only manage to get things done when they start ignoring climate justice. And that was like, okay, that's a fairly stark perspective on things. So I'll be very interested to see, like, I think that there's great potential for that, for finding like ways to use the simulator to suggest potential avenues there. So that would be definitely very interesting. By the way, we're past the hour. I just noticed. Yeah, it's 12:02. So thank you very much, Christian, for coming to join this. This talk was captivating. It was energizing. You really touched on a lot of topics, and very much in like a holistic way that I think opened a lot of like different perspectives on how to think about these issues. As usual, thank you for all the great tips and tricks. I'm sure like participants are eating that up right now and already looking through sources, seeing like, oh, how do I use this to my advantage? How do I design a better solution? So thank you very much. It's very cool to get like great insights from quality researchers, and thank you for your time for being here. This is very cool to listen to your presentation. Cool to pick your brain. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks for having me. And if anyone wants to reach out, like, please contact me. Andrew will know my email address. Yep. Love to stay in touch. It's the beginning, for me, and I would love to see like where things go.
Definitely.
And hear from you guys. Thank you. Learn from you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
That's great. Awesome. Thanks. Bye, Christian.